So my name's Kester. I'm actually a teacher, so I teach mathematics. So why the heck I'm here to talk about radical theology and piracy, who knows, but we'll find out if that's going to work. So anyone got a good pirate joke? No. Okay. I asked Pete that earlier, and he said the best pirate joke is this, your book. And I will deal with that later. So, I wrote a book basically about the culture of piracy. And the reason I did that was and there were a number of things. Firstly, my son kept getting invited. He's 8 years old now, but a few years ago, he kept getting invited to all these pirate parties. And that was kind of odd, because pirates are quite violent, nasty figures. He wasn't invited to any aggravated robbery parties. But plenty of pirate parties, And I was thinking, and then you suddenly realize that piracy is everywhere. Piracy is absolutely everywhere. And for any of you know Barry at all, you'll know he has a skull fetish. Everything to do with skulls and death, effectively. So going around LA today, we basically had the death skull tour of LA, like all these high fashion places, which is fantastic. But the point is that skull and crossbones motif, which we have on the flag over there. Just wave the flag. Can we wave the flag? Yeah. You can find that everywhere, and in some really surprising places, like on flags and headdresses and T-shirts and hooked hands. And then baby bottles. You've just given birth to this beautiful baby, and you give it a bottle of milk with a skull and crossbones on it. I thought, this is bizarre. What is this whole thing to do with pirates about? So I started to look at a wide range of things of where piracy comes up. And in the book, I kind of look historically at, Atlantic piracy, and then look at media piracy, so pirate radio and book piracy. And there's a whole kind of incredible history of piracy across so many areas, including Somali piracy and all that kind of stuff. And trying to link up what the common themes in those might be, okay? Now, interestingly, why we're here tonight is because in doing that, I found this kind of weird back door into radical theology, which was a bit of a surprise to me. I hadn't really intended to write a particularly theological book, although having written it, it turns out that it is, I think, quite profoundly theological. So what I want to do is to kind of do a little bit of a weave through that story very quickly, and then get to the radical theology whereby these two guys are going to join me, and we'll talk about what exactly that means, basically. So I did do some notes, which is what you're meant to do when you speak, but they're all turning around the wrong way. Yeah. The pirates' general thing across all of these things through history and social stuff and internet piracy, radio, media, Somali piracy. What I was trying to look for the common theme, pirates emerge whenever something that is held in common is enclosed into private ownership. Okay? So pirates emerge to break that down and to try and return something back to the commons. Okay? So if we use the example, which I do in the book, of pirate radio, you had the BBC and their terribly stuffy post-war BBC radio service, and there was only allowed 1 hour a week of pop music. Now, something that was, massively important to people, something that should be held in common, all this popular music, only given 1 hour a week, it had been enclosed and tightened down. So what happens is the pirate radio stations crop up, and they're off the coast of the UK, and those pirate radio stations are suddenly, playing all this music, and it's releasing something that had been enclosed back into public ownership. How does that work in Somalia? Now, Somali piracy at the moment is in a very different place. It's controlled by, organized crime, syndicates, and all this kind of stuff. But the original Somali pirates, the original ones, they were basically fishermen whose livelihoods have been completely destroyed. So the waters around Somalia, the European trawlers had been in and emptied all the seas of fish, and other governments had been through and dumped their toxic waste in the waters, so that their livelihoods are completely shot. And all the time they're seeing these container ships with billions of dollars of goods sailing past, using their waters, and they're thinking, what the hell? we deserve a bit of that, don't we? So piracy for them was really a shore tax. It was like, look, we need to break open this very enclosed wealth that had been put into these containers and being shipped past. And like, look, break that open. We deserve a bit of that, basically. That was the original move for pirates in that situation. And then you look at pirates, the Pirates of the Caribbean and all of that kind of stuff. What was that really about? Well, at the time, you've got this brand new world opening up. The world of the Americas and the Caribbean and all of that. And that is an enormous new commons, as it were. It's a space which no one, they thought in the West, obviously, or in Europe, no one actually owned. This was a completely new world. So you've got the English and the Spanish going out there, basically trying to enclose that commons. They're trying to enclose that into private ownership. And who do they get to do that? Well, they get these guys on their naval boats, and they go out there with these sailors who they've whipped off the streets of London. They take them away from their families, and they sail them off under brutal, brutal conditions. The sailors in the Royal Navy ships were treated absolutely abysmally, worse than slaves in one sense, in the work they had to do and the terrible, terrible conditions they were kept in. And all the time, what they're effectively doing is creating enormous wealth for a bunch of merchants and princes back in Europe. But that wealth is completely enclosed. They have no access to that at all. So the decision to turn pirate was not a decision to thieve, by the way, because everyone was doing the thievery. They were simply carrying on when they turned pirate, doing what they were trained to do already. They were already being trained to thieve. The kings were telling them, you go and raid those boats, raid those islands. All of that stuff was normal to them in the navies. What they were told to do, when they turned to piracy, they were simply breaking that open and having some of that for themselves, sharing it out commonly. And the pirate ships functioned on highly democratic principles. The election of their own officers, the food was shared equally. They had these kind of extraordinary things. I'm getting into dodgy waters here. If you talk about healthcare in the States, that's probably not a very good thing, is it? But, universal healthcare. If you lost an arm on a Royal Naval ship, you're just chucked overboard or cast off a board because you're completely useless then. You're not a functioning sailor anymore. If you lost an arm on a pirate ship, you could be paid the equivalent of about $30,000 in today's money. So they really cared for each other. And, it's kind of funny, really, because you get these hooked hands. How can I borrow the hook a moment? Oh! It's not a real hook. It's a pretend. That's a small one, yeah. It is quite small, yeah. But, the classic pirate, and he's got the wooden leg and the hooked hand and the one eye. Barry might tell you a very bad joke about how you get the one eye in a bit. But there's kind of funny things there about acceptance of people with disabilities, They were accepting of others. They were saying, you can still be a fully functioning pirate even with all these other things, okay? So piracy is about breaking open the commons. It's about giving people access back to the commons. And I explain that far more in a bit. But the interesting link then is all of these kind of historical, cultural things about land ownership and a huge movement of piracy on land, resisting the enclosure of common land in England in the kind of 15, 16, 1700s. All of those things are kind of external stuff. But then you begin to look at what happens when we begin to examine pirates in terms of literature and film, and what function do pirates play in those things. Now I'll give you two examples of that. The first is to do with Peter Pan, and the second to do with Star Wars, okay? Any Star Wars fans here? Woo! Yes. When Peter Pan fans? Any Peter Pan fans in the house? Yeah. Yeah. Funny story. If you read the book, there is a section about Star Wars, and someone got back in touch with me. They may be in the building today. Saying you are actually technically wrong about Star Wars. It wasn't that particular planet, and I was like, oh my God, I've got into a world here I do not know enough about. However, Peter Pan. So the Peter Pan story is very, very interesting. You've got, first of all, a boy who's lost his shadow, and any of you in therapy out there will know that's a kind of odd place to be. If you've lost a connection with your shadow, we're already on kind of strange territory here. And then there's this family, and they live in Kensington, which is a nice part of London. And Wendy is the oldest girl in the family, and it's her last night in the nursery. She's on the cusp of moving from girlhood to womanhood. And yet, she's not able to make that transition properly because her parents go out for the evening and leave her in charge of the other kids, and there's his dog around and stuff. So she's got this kind of blocked existence, as it is shown in the book. And who comes to do that but Peter Pan? Says, look, come with me, you don't need to worry about that. Come off to Neverland, where you never grow up. So off they fly, and they go to Neverland. And it seems really great, except she ends up in an even more blocked state. Because now she can't grow up. And not only can she not grow up, but she's ended up looking after these lost boys. So she's kind of playing the role of mother without being able to access the role of mother because she can't grow up. And there's frustration that grows within the play because nothing can change there. Well, who comes to break out that enclosure, that kind of blocked place, but the pirate, Captain Hook, who, interestingly enough, is being chased by a crocodile who's got the ticking clock, so there's a kind of reintroduction of time into the play. And the pirates disrupt the narrative. They overcome Captain Hook, and off they go back. Now, interestingly, in the original setting of the play, the person who plays Captain Hook is the same person who plays her father. So Wendy, in the overcoming of this pirate, is also overcoming the father figure, and that allows her to go back. The situation is unblocked, and off she goes into womanhood. And we know that is a repeated cycle because Wendy's mother recognizes Pan when they go back to London. So from her own childhood, that this is a process of overcoming a blockage and entering into a new stage of life. Okay. Now in Star Wars, I think it's The Empire Strikes Back, and I'm not going to be held to that, and he's R2-D2 people, whatever. I speak 42 million languages. So in Empire Strikes Back, Luke can be found at one point, I won't get into the details because I don't know them, but he's hanging below something and Darth Vader is above him with his lightsaber, and says, "Oh, Luke, I am your father." He wasn't Indian though, was he? There was a different accent. Yeah. So he said, "Luke, I am your father," and Luke says, "No, no, 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 no," even though he I think he probably does know it, but And Vader says to him, come and join me, and only together can we bring balance to the Force, only together can we bring balance to the Force. And of course, Vader represents, the empire, conservatism, all of that kind of stuff. And if you kind of go back to right at the beginning of the stories, it's basically a trade war. So it's all about, controlling trade again, which is a very kind of those pirate themes coming through. And who does Luke represent? He represents the rebellion. Okay. Now, Vader wants to basically subsume Luke's life into his own. That only together we can bring balance to the forces. Only by combining ourselves that effectively I can gain power. Vader wants to stay in power. And what does Luke do? He says no, and he lets go and effectively falls away to what Vader must consider is his death. And rejects that offer that his father makes. But strange enough, it's through that rejection of his father's offer that, in a roundabout way, Vader ends up actually being saved. So again, we have this process of overcoming the father, of saying, okay, I'm not going to follow in my father's footsteps, I'm going to do something radically different. But through that, actually, there is some salvation that occurs for that person. Okay? So that's how kind of pirates function in literature and film. They come to bring us a disturbance to a blocked situation and allow us to move forward into a new place. Now, the blocked situation par excellence, really, the major archetypal blocked situation is not to do with overcoming the father in terms of parents. It's not to do with trade or anything. The blocked situation above all is perhaps the blockage with God and the blockage of religion. Okay, so it was kind of strange that having come all this way with pirates, that the final story really, the kind of real pirate story is about playing pirate with religion. Now, there are a couple of interconnected stories I want to tell to demonstrate that, and then we'll get to these guys back on to talk about what we mean about that theologically. The story I want to focus on particularly is the story of the prodigal son, which is, in the traditional telling, this wonderful tale of redemption, of a rebellious young guy who goes off and does some very naughty things in a long way away and spends money and drinks and does other things. And then, gets very poor, and he decides, okay, I'll go back, but my father's going to really hate me. And his father doesn't. He goes out to meet him, and everything's brilliant and fine, and there's restoration. Everyone's read the Henri Nouwen book, right? Return of the Prodigal Son, that's lovely. Now, I'm not saying that reading is wrong. This is a parable. It supports multiple meanings within it. And I want to tell a kind of a dark, inverted reading of that parable, whereby I think there is a suggestion within it that actually the parable is a tragedy. And it's a tragedy because it is a failed pirate story. Now, Luke's original version begins, there was once a man who had 2 sons. So that really, the protagonist of the story is the father, not the 2 sons. But if you imagine retelling the story from the son's perspective, he's there, he's working away on his father's compound, and the place seems pretty rich. There's wealth here. They live a good life. And I think there's a sense of grievance, really. The 2 brothers aren't really particularly happy, and the son, he wants to go and do something else. He wants to bust out of this place. He wants to go and see the world. So he commits that terrible thing of asking his father for the wealth, and off he goes. Like every other student did going to college, and has a great time and spends time and sees all this stuff, and wow, it's fantastic, He's broken out of there. And he ends up in a place of need. I mean, there's starvation and there's hunger, and he thinks, you know what? My dad's money could do good here. If only my dad could come and work here, we could help these people. But he gets very hungry, and the turn point of the story is where he's, there in amongst the pigs, kind of craving after the food that they get. He says, look, I cannot go back as a son, and I would not want to do that. I don't want to go back to that place of privilege. But to go back as an honest laborer, okay, to go back and do honest labor, at least I can pay my own way. And he heads back to his father, who has not gone out looking for him. And that's the interesting thing. If you compare the parables around that, you've got the parable of the lost coin, where the woman empties the entire house to look for this coin, does all this huge active stuff. And then there's the parable of the lost sheep, where he leaves the 99 and goes way off to find the one. Well, the father, he kind of looks around a bit. He doesn't really go and try and find the son. But so the son goes back, and the ring goes back on his finger, and the cloak goes back on, and all the trappings of comfort and power and status return to him. And he says, I was alive, but now I am dead again. Because the tragedy of the prodigal son story is nothing changes. The empire is conserved. And the father learns nothing. And that's perhaps why the older son is so irritated. It's like, you were meant to be doing this for both of us. You're meant to be busting out of here, but nothing changes at all. Now, a parallel story which Luke must have known. He must have known because he was a Greek. It's the story of the Odyssey. Anyone know well the story of the Odyssey? Oh, shh. You're not allowed to speak. No. So the basic story of the Odyssey is we've got Odysseus who's fought the Trojan War for many, many years, and he wants to get back home. Except he annoys one of the gods, and the gods thwart his journey back home. Okay? He just cannot get back to Ithaca. And his wife is waiting in Ithaca, and he cannot get back home. And instead of getting back home, he has all these trials, and he goes off to these islands and is tempted by these beautiful women, and there's all these other fights and all the rest of it. And Athena comes to Odysseus' son, Telemachus. Telemachus in Greek means far from war. So he's immediately been distanced in the narrative from his father as a different person. And Athena, who is almost like the anti-god, she's the god of reason, of philosophy, of just war, of logical thought, She's the kind of rational one, says, you need to go out and look for your dad. So he goes on this journey, searches all round for him, and he does eventually find Odysseus. And where does he find him? Well, he finds him back on Ithaca, stuck out living with this pig herder. already on the island where he could have just walked home. And he's like, what stopped you from coming home? Why didn't you come home? So what Telemachus does is to challenge his father to basically make that final step and to make that change and to come home. Now, interestingly, the turning point of that story, of the Odyssey, is again with this character in amongst pigs, in amongst these animals. And I'll throw it out as a hypothesis. Who knows? But in that, there's perhaps a hint of the turn in the beginnings of the Christian story with God coming to earth amongst the animals, and being born into a manger. Okay? Now, the key question about the Odyssey is, what was really stopping Odysseus from coming home? Because he would spout on about the gods are stopping him, and, I just cannot get back home. There's this big other who's stopping me moving. And in fact, not just stopping me moving, but I've got to fight all the time and then be tempted by beautiful women. Well, perhaps actually he was stopping himself from going home. And it was only as Telemachus kind of pushes that to one side, with Athena as this kind of anti-god, and says, you know what, forget about those big others. You've just simply got to make that step to come home. Perhaps that was what needed to happen. Now, going back to the prodigal son and then the story of Jesus, what my contention is, and I'll end with this and then get back to the radical theology part, is that Jesus turns the tragedy of the prodigal son and completes it as a triumph. He leaves his wealthy and enclosed home in heaven, comes down to earth, finds suffering, finds so much need, and is perhaps simply tempted to go back and leave nothing changed at all. But he totally refuses to do that. He refuses simply to return back home, be welcomed back in, put back on those, the ring and the cloak and everything would just be hunky-dory, just as it was before, because he does not want the empire to remain unchanged. And in the death of Jesus, what we're seeing again is that challenge to the big other. Because, we read that cry on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me, And perhaps just with a change of intonation, why have you forsaken me? What's your problem? Why have you forsaken me? Why are you so angry about this? Why are you angry that I'm here? This is like some kind of obsessive, compulsive God up there who just, purity and everything, and you can't have anything dirty, whatever. Like, why did you forsake me? What's your problem? Just get over it. And rather than returning back to heaven, Jesus busts open heaven. He says, you know what? You're going to have to come back down here. And the temple curtain ripped open, and out we come. And that is the truly fulfilled piratic act, is to bust open an enclosed, privatized, cold, and blocked religion and bring it back into the commons. To bring it back into the commons. But in doing that, the Father has to change. The Father has to be overcome. And it's that move that is, I think, the essential move within a radical theological movement, which is to say, the big other needs to be destroyed. The big other needs to be destroyed because in doing that, we are then restoring people to a work within the commons with one another without this blockage carrying on like that. So the move of pirates takes us from busting open economic situations, cultural situations in literature and film, to the truly piratic move, which is the pirates of the divine, as it were. And it's that, I think, that breaks open into a very, very challenging place of overcoming the big other.